Jawaharlal Nehru. The past in its relation to the present. This urge to action, this desire to experience life through action, has influenced all my thought and activity, even sustained thinking apart from being itself a kind of action, becomes part of the action to come. It is not something entirely abstract, in the void, unrelated to action and life. The past becomes something that leads up to the present, the moment of action, the future, something that flows from it, and all three are inextricably intertwined and interrelated. Even my seemingly actionless life in prison is tagged on somehow by some process of thought and feeling to coming or imagined action, and so it gains for me a certain content without which it would be a vacuum in which existence would become intolerable. When actual action has been denied me, I have shot some such approach to the past and to history, because my own personal experiences have often touched historic events, and sometimes I have even had something to do with the influencing of such events in my own sphere. It has not been difficult for me to envisage history as a living process with which I could identify myself to some extent. I came late to history, and even then, not through the usual direct road of learning a mass of facts and dates and drawing conclusions and inferences from them, unrelated to my life's course. So long as I did this, history had little significance for me. I was still less interested in this supernatural or problems of a future life. Science and the problems of today and of our present life attracted me far more. Some mixture of thought and emotions and urges of which I was only dimly conscious, led me to action, and action in its turn sent me back to thought and a desire to understand the present. The roots of that present lay in the past, and so I made voyages of discovery into the past, ever seeking a clue in it, if any such existed, to the understanding of the present. The domination of the present never left me, even when I lost myself in musing of past events and of person far away and long ago, forgetting where or what I was. If I felt occasionally that I belonged to the past, I felt also that the whole of the past belonged to me in the present. Past history merged into contemporary history. It became a living reality tied up with sensations of pain and pleasure. If the past had a tendency to become the present also sometimes receded into the distant past and assumed its immobile, status quo appearances. In the midst of an intensity of action itself, there would suddenly come a feeling as if it was some past event and one was looking at it, as it were, in retrospect. It was this attempt to discover the past in its relation to the present that led me 12 years ago to write Glimpse of World History in the form of letter to my daughter. I wrote rather superficially I wrote rather superficially and as simply as I could, for I was writing for a girl in her early teens, but behind that writing lay that quest and voyage of discovery. A sense of adventure filled me, and I lived successively different ages and periods, and had for companions men and women who had lived long ago. I had leisure in jail. There was no sense of hurry or of completing a task within an allotted period of time, so I let my mind wander or take root for a while, keeping in tune with my mood. allowing impressions to sink in and feel the dry bones of the past with flesh and blood. It was a similar quest, though limited to recent and more intimate times and persons, that led me later to write my autobiography. I suppose I have changed a good deal during these 12 years. I have grown more contemplative. There is perhaps a little more poise and equilibrium, some sense of detachment, a greater calmness of spirit. I am not overcome now to the same extent as I used to be by tragedy or what I conceived to be tragedy. The turmoil and disturbance are less and are more temporary, even though the tragedies have been a far greater scale. Is this, I have wondered, the growth of a spirit resignation, or is this a toughening of the texture? It is just is and a lessening of vitality and of the passion of life, or it is due to long periods in prison and life slowly ebbing away and the thoughts that fill the mind passing through after a brief stay, leaving only ripples behind. The tortured mind seeks some mechanism of escape, the senses get dulled from repeated talks, and a feeling comes over one that so much evil and misfortune shadow the world that a little more or less does not make much difference. There is only one thing that remains to us that cannot be taken away: to act with courage and dignity and to stick to the ideals that have given meaning to life. But that is not the politician's way. Someone said the other day, death is the birthright of every person born, a curious way of putting an obvious thing. It is a birthright which nobody has denied or can deny, and which all of us seek to forget and escape so long as we may. And yet, there was something novel and attractive about the phrase. Those who complain so bitterly of life have always a way out of it, if they so choose. This is always in our power to achieve. If we cannot master life, we can at least master death, a pleasing thought, lessening the feeling of helplessness. Life's philosophy. 6 or 7 years ago, an American publisher asked me to write an essay on my philosophy of life for a symposium he was preparing. I was attracted to the idea, but I hesitated, and the more I thought over it, the more reluctant I grew. Ultimately, I did not write that essay. What was my philosophy of life? I didn't know. Some years earlier, I would not have been so hesitant. There was a definiteness about my thinking and objectives then which has faded away since. The events of the past few years in India, China, Europe, and all over the world have been confusing, upsetting, and distressing, and the future has become vague and shadowy and has lost the clearness of outline which is once possessed in my mind. This doubt and difficulty about fundamental matters did not come in my way in regard to immediate action, except that it blunted somewhat the sharp edge of that activity. No longer could I function, as I did in my younger days, as an arrow flying automatically to the target of my choice, ignoring all else but the target. Yet I functioned, for the urge to action was there, and a real or imagined coordination of that action with the ideals I hated. But a growing distaste of politics as I saw them seized me, and gradually my whole attitude to life seemed to undergo a transformation. The ideals and objectives of yesterday were still the ideals of today, but they had lost some of their lustre, and even as one seemed to go towards them, they lost the shining beauty which had warmed the heart and vitalized the body. Evil triumphed often enough, but what was far worse was the coarsening and distortion of what had seemed so right. Was human nature so essentially bad that it would take ages of training through suffering and misfortune before it could behave reasonably and raise man above the creator of lust and violence and deceit that he now was? And meanwhile, was every effort to change it radically in the present, the near future, doomed to failure? Ends and means, were they tied up inseparably, acting and reacting on each other, the wrong means distorting and sometimes even destroying the end in view? But the right means might well be beyond the capacity of infirm and selfish human nature. What then was one to do? Not to act was a complete confession of failure and a submission to evil. To act meant often enough a compromise with some form of that evil, with all the untoward consequences that such compromises result in. My early approach to life's problems had been more or less scientific, with something of the easy optimism of the science of the 19th and early 20th century, a secure and comfortable existence, and the energy and self confidence I possessed increased that feeling of optimism. A kind of vague humanism appealed to me. Religion, as I saw it practiced and accepted even by thinking minds, whether it was Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism or Christianity, did not attract me. It seemed to be closely associated with superstitious practices and dogmatic beliefs, and behind it lay a method of approach to life's problem which was certainly not that of science. There was an element of magic about it, an uncritical condulousness, a reliance on the supernatural. Yet, it was obvious that religion had supplied some deeply felt inner need of human nature, and that the vast majority of people all over the world could not do without some form of religious belief. It had produced many fine types of men and women, as well as bigoted, narrow minded, cruel tyrants. It had given a set of values to human life, and though some of these values had no application today or were even harmful, others were still the foundation of morality and ethics. In the wider sense of word, religion dealt with the uncharted reasons of human experience, uncharted, that is, by the scientific positive knowledge of the day. In a sense, it might be considered an extension of the known and chartered reason, though the method of science and reason were utterly unlike each other, and to a large extent they had to deal with different kinds of media. It was obvious that there was a vast unknown reason and around us, and science, with its magnificent achievements, knew HTTLC enough about it. Though it was making tentative approaches in that direction, probably also the normal methods of science, its dealing with the visible world and the processes of life were not wholly adapted to the physical, the artistic, the spiritual, and other elements of the invisible world. Life does not consist entirely of what we see and hear and feel. The visible world, which is undergoing change in time and space, it is continually touching an invisible world of other and possibly more stable or equally changeable elements, and no thinking person can ignore this invisible world. Science does not tell us much, or for that matter of that anything about the purpose of life. It is now widening its boundaries, and it may invade the so-called invisible world before long and help us to understand this purpose of life in its widest sense, or at least give us some glimpses of which glimpses which illumine the problem of human existence. The old controversy between science and religion takes a new form, the application of the scientific method of emotional and religious experiences. Religion merges into mysticism and metaphysics and philosophy, There have been great mystics, attractive figures who cannot easily be disposed of as self deluded fools. Yet, mysticism in the narrow sense of word irritates me. It appears to be vague and soft and flavy, not rigorous discipline of the mind, but the surrender of mental faculties and a living in a sea of emotional experience. The experience may lead occasionally to some insight into inner and less obvious processes, but it is also likely to lead to self delusion. Metaphysics and philosophy, or a metaphysical philosophy, have a greater appeal to the mind. They require hard thinking and the application of logic and reasoning. Though all this is necessarily based on some premises which are presumed to be self evident and yet which may or may not be true. All thinking persons, to a greater or less degree, dabble in metaphysics and philosophy, for not to do so is to ignore many of the aspects of the universe of ours. Some may feel more attracted to them than others, and the emphasis on them may vary in different ages. In the ancient world, both in Asia and Europe, all the emphasis was laid on the supremacy of the inward life over things external, and this inevitably led to metaphysics and philosophy. The modern man is wrapped up much more in these things external, and yet, even be in moments of crisis and mental trouble, often turn to philosophy and metaphysical speculations. Some vague or more precise philosophy of life we all have, though most of us accept unthinkingly the general attitude which is characteristics of our generations and environment. Most of us accept all certain metaphysical conceptions as part of the faith in which we have grown up. I have not been attracted towards metaphysics. In fact, I have had a certain distaste for vague speculation, and yet I have sometimes found a certain intellectual fascination in trying to follow the rigid lines of metaphysical and philosophic thoughts of the ancient or the moderns, but I have never felt a case there and have escaped from their spell with a feeling of relief. Essentially, I'm interested in the world, in this life, not in some other world or a future life. Whether there is such a thing as a soul, or whether there is survival after death or not, I do not know. And important as these questions are, they do not trouble me in the least. The environment in which I have grown up takes the soul, or rather the alma, and a future life, the karma theory of cause and effect and reincarnation, for granted. I have been affected by this, and so, in a sense, I am a soul which survives the physical death of the body, and a theory of cause and effects governing life's action seems reasonable, though it leads to obvious difficulties which, when once think of the ultimate cause, pre-assuming a soul, there appears to be some logic also in the theory of reincarnation.